Good morning, good afternoon, Your Excellencies, dear colleagues, dear friends. Welcome to the second day of the Mine Action Week, the 24th International Meeting of Mine Action National Directors of United Nations Advisors. I'm very pleased to open the plenary session 3 on community engagement matters and to welcome our 5 distinguished panelists. This event will be recorded and available online. And if you wish to ask questions, please, I invite you to use the Q&A section. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, communities must be listened to and have a meaningful role in processes and issues that affect them. We often, and rightly so, claim that communities are at the heart of our work. In our framework's mission statement or vision, we reaffirm that we work for and with communities. How does this translate into concrete measures in the field? To which extent do we engage communities in clearance, advocacy, risk education, or victims assistance? Do we perceive communities as recipients or as agents of change? Do we consult them and stop there, or do we go beyond and promote and support their capacity, autonomy, and initiatives? What do we do for communities to plan, take action, and be heard in all matters that affect them? Those are some of the questions that we'll attempt to address today. The UN guidelines define community engagement as a strategic process to directly involve local populations in all aspects of decision-making and implementation to strengthen local capacities, community structures, and local ownership, as well as to improve transparency, accountability, and optimal resource allocation across diverse settings. Several international agreements in recent years, for example, the Grand Bargain or the Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness, have highlighted the need for improved practice, coordination, integration, and measurement of community engagement. The mine action sector has commitments to ensure that needs, priorities, and capacity for explosive ordnance affected communities are front and center. But how do we implement those commitments, including in increasingly complex operating contexts? The Geneva International Center for Community Engagement for humanitarian demining has commissioned Artios Global to undertake a research piece on community engagement in mine action. Based on a cross-sectoral sampling across and beyond the mine action sector, the research has found a comprehensive keenness in engaging with the community, but a lack of consistency in terms of community engagement. This despite the intrinsic link between community engagement, context sensitivity, and accountability, both to affected people and donors. According to Artios, what is needed is not new approaches, but rather a rethink of current ways of working, including potentially drawing on non-mine action approaches to community engagement and accountability. In fact, 2 of our panelists today do not have mine action background, and we also need to learn from other sectors. Ladies and gentlemen, this plenary will unpack community engagement as a necessary, powerful, ethical, and vital approach for all mine action pillars. In particular, the panelists will take stock of the state of play on community engagement in mine action, identify best practices, and explore avenues for improvement. So let me turn now to our first panelist. His Excellency Mr. Panharith was the Executive Director of the ASEAN Regional Mine Action Center until 2020. He is Deputy Secretary General of the Cambodian Mine Action and Victim Assistance since 2014. Mr. Panharith, thank you so much for joining us today. I give you the floor.
Thank you, Madam. First, can I check if you can hear me? Yes? All right. Madam Chair and colleagues, it is my pleasure to join this panel. Without further ado, I will start my presentation. For those colleagues who are not familiar with mine action in Cambodia, allow me to give a brief context. Cambodia is contaminated by both landmines and explosive remnant of war. By the end of year 2020, about 2,000 square kilometers of contaminated area has been released, and about 2,000 square kilometers more remains contaminated and needs to be released. Please note that in Cambodia, humanitarian mine action started in 1992, and not long after that, community engagement approaches have been applied in mine action processes. We embrace community participation and ownership because we believe that the more community can identify their problems, the more engaged and empowered they are to address those problems. Today, I will share with you 3 topics of community engagement in mine action as displayed on the screen. Next slide, please. Topic 1, community-based mine UXO risk reduction. The Cambodian Mine Action Center established this network in 2001 with the support of HI Belgium and UNICEF. The UXO1 was launched a few years later. Currently, there are more than 3,000 volunteers in this network. They are recruited at village, commune, and district level. They do not get payment, but receive materials and training from Cambodian Mine Action Center to do their work. So how do they define their mine and UXO problem and priority in their village? With their training and local knowledge, these volunteers organize a series of meetings. They marked the contaminated areas and accident location on the map and discuss how agricultural land, other livelihood activities, and development needs are impeded by the contamination. By doing this, they can also identify the high-risk households. Then they come up with their own strategies to provide risk education to the targeted high-risk takers. They carry out other actions like linking their village needs with the explosive ordnance disposal, clearance, victim assistance services, alternative income generation activities, and development projects. A key principle of the network is that the local people own the process. Therefore, all the materials and information they produce are kept in their village. It means that other organizations coming to the village can also make use of these local resources. What keeps the flywheel of this network going? First, being a volunteer will give them reputation in their village and give them skill and knowledge that they can apply in other aspects of their lives. Moreover, the volunteer can see how impactful their work is to save lives and limbs and contribute to development in their village. It is a combination of these elements that help ensure the success and sustainability of this network. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. Topic 2, Cambodian Mine and ERW Victim Information System. MAC founded this system in 1994 and soon after handed over to Cambodian Red Cross, who managed it with the support from HI Belgium and UNICEF. In 2010, the system was handed over to Cambodian Mine Action and Victim Assistance Authority. From now, let me call it CMAA for ease of reference. Currently, in Phnom Penh head office, there are 4 CMAA staff in provinces. In Phnom Penh head office, there are 4 CMAA staff, and in provinces, there are 15 CMAA data gatherers and more than 1,000 volunteers to support this system. There are some similarities between this system and the community-based mine risk reduction network I just talked in topic 1, like the reason for their success and sustainability, which I will not repeat. But the work that makes this system different and outstanding is its emphasis on data collection, analysis, and reporting on mine and ERW casualty and accidents, in addition to providing risk education. Now, I will explain how the data is gathered. When there is an accident, the nearest volunteers will inform the data gatherers who is deployed in that province. Within days, the data gatherer will visit and interview the survivor or their family and complete the form. Finally, all the completed forms are sent to CMAA on a monthly basis. From these forms, CMAA issue a monthly report. The report is the most reliable source of information on casualty and accident that mine action stakeholders can use for planning and prioritizing mine action activities in Cambodia. You can find location of accident, cause of accident, type of casualty, sex, age, and so on. Next slide, please. Topic 3, planning and prioritization for mine clearance. Cambodia adopts top-down and bottom-up approaches for planning and prioritization process. Let me begin with the top-down approach. Step 1, identifying priority villages, highlighted in red color at the top of the chart, represent the top-down approach. Under this step, CMAA organized the consultation with key mine action stakeholders to develop a list of priority villages. Then the list is passed down to the provincial and local authorities who prepare an annual mine clearance work plan. That's where the bottom-up approach takes place. There are guidelines with 100 pages detailing this process, but we will not go to that detail. Our focus should be on step 2, identifying priority minefields, that is to underscore community engagement. Under this step 2, the village chief organized meetings with villagers to talk about mine problems and priority in the village. Some of them can be volunteers from topic 1 and 2. They will discuss if there are needs of more safe land for road or housing or farming, or if there are frequent mine accidents, or all of this. Therefore, they will identify a list of priority minefields together and send it to higher levels to decide. Madam Chair and colleagues, it comes to the end of my part. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Pagna. Let me hand over now to Ms. Alessia Radice. She's a Communication for Development Specialist and a global expert on social norms at UNICEF. So over to you, Ms. Radice.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. I'm going to talk to you today about community engagement and the standards. How do we ensure that we actually make community engagement meaningful? Next slide, please. But before we start, I would like us to think about, I'll just illustrate an example that we've all familiar with to a certain extent, which is the example of the latest Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, this was a challenging outbreak that took a while to bring under control for a series of reasons. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So a range of challenges happened in this situation, in this outbreak. For example, treatment centers were being attacked because they were associated with vested interests, both financial and political. And there was a belief that anyone who went to the treatment center would never come back. So people didn't go. They would not seek medical attention, thus risking to spread the disease even more. Communication materials, although they were translated in the local language, they were actually misinterpreted by the community members. Also, there was a lot of emphasis on hemorrhagic symptoms of Ebola, and that because that wasn't so evident, people didn't see it that much. It led to people not believing that Ebola existed, and this led to them not practicing any protective behaviors because they thought it was not real. People would bury their dead in secret because they were worried that they couldn't do things the way they wanted culturally. And although religious leaders were trying to promote protective behaviors, people didn't believe them and didn't trust them because they thought they were getting money for it. And finally, people would not trust the medical professionals, thinking that they would misdiagnose anything from malaria to a simple cold as Ebola. So as you can see, even this intervention that was so comprehensive, it provided a treatment, it provided health personnel, it worked with the community leaders, it translated everything into local languages. Despite all of that, it still didn't work. And the only way that they could really improve this intervention and bring Ebola under control was by engaging communities meaningfully. It was not just a question of going into the community, having a chat with a couple of leaders, and then coming away. It was engaging community meaningfully. But what is community engagement? Next slide, please. So there are many different definitions of community engagement in the literature, but most will agree on the fact that community engagement works with all representatives of the community. It's not just with a couple of leaders. It's not just with a few of your target group. It's with all the community, civil society, leaders, parents, women's groups, and so on. It empowers social groups and social networks. And if you think about it, social groups and social networks are the community. It builds on local strengths and capacities. So you don't come into a community and bring in things without knowing what is there. You build on what is already there. That way it's going to be stronger and more sustainable. And Community engagement improves participation and ownership, which leads to sustainability. Next slide, please. So why should we engage communities? So first of all, community engagement is actually a critical component of all development and humanitarian practice. It's not just the community mobilizers that need to do it. We all need to do it. Community engagement empowers communities, and this leads to more equitable and impactful initiatives. And finally, community engagement is actually an intrinsic human rights, it's intrinsic to the human rights-based approach. So we can't just not do it. And next slide, please. Despite community engagement being a well-known name, at least in principle, historically, it's been done in many different ways. There hasn't been any specific guidance on how to do it. So people would go into communities, they would have a word with a couple of leaders, maybe the authorities, and they think they did community engagement. But the intervention still met the challenges that I described earlier in the Ebola example. And so UNICEF, a few years, decided to work on developing a guidance for minimum standards. So what is the minimum that you can do to ensure that your community engagement is meaningful? And this resulted from an extensive literature review and consultation process with a range of stakeholders. Next slide, please. And this led to the development of these core minimum standards that have 4 parts to them. Part A, which you see on the left hand of this screen, is the core community engagement standards. And these really are the core standards that we should try and embed in everything we do with communities. And I'd like to point out that everything that we do in humanitarian and development practice is with communities. At one point, we need to touch communities. That's where the change needs to happen. And the right-hand on this side, so parts B to D, are more operational standards. The part A is primarily programmatic standards, and parts B to D are operation standards. They tell you how to implement, how to coordinate, how to do resource mobilization. And next slide, please. So I will just very briefly look at the core community engagement standards that we want to embed everywhere. And as you can see, there are many principles there. We have participation, we have empowerment and ownership, really important to make sure that communities believe that this is in their interest and their project. We need to look at inclusion, and inclusion means bringing the communities together to help you identify who is being excluded, because you don't know. You don't know who the vulnerable groups in your community are. You don't know who are the ones who tend to be excluded. And very importantly, community engagement, to be meaningful, needs to have a two-way communication approach. We need to set mechanisms up that allow everyone to provide input and tell you about your intervention. And by everyone, we don't just mean those who speak your language, those who are empowered, those who are educated, but even the vulnerable ones, even the ones that traditionally in the community are not given opportunities to speak up. So we need to ensure we have these systems in place. We need to make sure that what we do is adaptable and localized to the situation. And as I said earlier, that it builds on the local capacity. And in these standards, we present both a description of these as well as examples on how to implement them, and a series of core, like a checklist of things that of core indicators to make sure that you're doing it meaningfully. So these engagement standards provide a lot of information to help you implement effectively. And I'll just end, next slide please, on a couple of questions for reflection. First of all, how can these standards be applied to all the different areas in mine action? How can they be institutionalized so that they become standard? And finally, are there any that we are already applying, and which ones should be strengthened? So these are just some questions for you to start reflecting on. Thank you very much. Last slide. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ms. Radice. And let me hand over now to Mr. Mondjii, Country Director of the mobile technology company Viamo in Nigeria. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are in the world. It's my pleasure to speak today. Actually, I'm gonna anchor what Alessia presented to us. So I'm gonna try and show with this presentation how technology can be used for risk communication and community engagement strategy. And as she rightfully pointed out, two-way communication, how to make it adaptable, personalize it, and localize it. So I'm going to provide also some examples of real life implementation. And then I will talk also about lessons learned for how to successfully implement um, your technology solutions, whether it be international development or humanitarian emergency, as we do both. So next slide, please. So Viamo stands for Via Mobile, and really our mission is to empower people with the information that they need. So we really want to send people some information that will allow them to make better decisions. And that's for the end beneficiary and also the organization that support them. So as you can see, we use primarily phone as our main tools, and the technology that we use works with both smartphone and simple phones. Next slide, please. So we've been working with many companies in the world, both private and public sector. Next slide, please. So the first question is why mobile? So very often what we've noticed is that it's a channel that is not yet leveraged very well. We see people leveraging TV, radio, print media, of course, social media a lot. But social media, sometimes you will see that, like where I am in Nigeria, only 30% of people have a smartphone. So that means you're foregoing 70% of the population. And then you have to have data. So social media is fantastic, especially in urban settings, but it doesn't always, it's not always optimal. On the other hand, simple phone, the penetration is very high. About 85% of people own a phone, and 90% of households have a phone. So it could be smartphone, simple phone. It works with any phone, and the technology we use works with any phone and any network, and it's measurable. So every time, the way IVR works, interactive voice response. Next slide, please. So interactive voice response is your typical way when you call a help desk or you answer a phone survey. They ask you, are you a man or a woman? Press 1 for men, press 2 for women. So we use a lot of that. So it transcends low literacy. In sub-Saharan Africa, 65%, only 65% of the people are literate. In Nigeria, 40% of the people are illiterate. So if we were using only SMS, which we do, or only social media, which we do, just because of the literacy problem, 40% of the population will not be in touch with us. So when we use the voice, interactive voice response, we can communicate with everybody. We can ask questions, people can respond to us, people can ask us questions, we can respond to them. And then we can translate in any languages, so we can speak to people in their language of their choice. Next slide, please. So one challenge for organization is really to have all this relationship with the mobile network operators. So with a company like Viamo, we've already connected to all the network operators. So you don't have to deal with that. And because we do massive amount of communication, SMS, USSD, or voice, we already negotiated the best rates for you. Next slide. So I'm going to give some example in real life, and also I'll give some example of private-public partnership. Next slide. So the Gaskia project, Gaskia in Hausa means truth. So we supported Mercy Corps with their risk communication and engagement strategy during COVID-19. So what they wanted to do is debunk false rumors in the community. Next slide, please. So what we did is we set up a hotline that people could call. If there were no operators, they could leave messages, and through our software, they could easily listen to the message and call back the people. They could understand the rumors, then they could transcribe them. And it was, once we educate the truth champion, it was their role to go back in the community and explain the rumors. So through this method, we debunked dozens of false rumors and had a really good impact in the community, which was in Borno, which is northeastern Nigeria. Next slide, please. So we also work with Save the Children and Unilever during COVID-19 to reach people and try to educate them on COVID-19 at the onset of the outbreak. Next slide, please. So we worked on mitigation, prevention of COVID, the symptoms of COVID, what is COVID, and also debunk false rumors. So we reached 2.5 million people in 10 states. And we use an outbound IVR campaign and infoline. So outbound means that we call people. Inbound would mean that people call us, which was the case in the previous project. It was more inbound because people called the infoline. For this project, we reach out to people with IVR calls, so voice and also SMS. So depending on the states, we change the language for the SMS. And for the voice, we use the language of the state, and then we give them an option to choose the language of their choice if they want it. Next slide, please. We also working with the Gates Foundation to train people for the livestock reforms. So here we have a mobile curriculum, and we digitize the content over audio line, and we send it to people to educate them on different topics. Next slide, please. I'm going to accelerate because I only have 1 minute left, and I really want to go to the lessons learned. Next slide. So I'll pass the PPP, the private-public partnership. I just want to go to the next slide. Next. Yes. So next slide. So one thing that we've noticed with the intervention is that preparation matters. So are we targeting the right people? Are the beneficiary ready and willing to receive the intervention? Next slide. So what we've noticed is that when we design the program, we try to use human-centered design. We try to be 360, which means that we really involve the beneficiaries right from the start, right from the onset, all the way to the end, which is really implementation, monitoring, and then post-mortem lessons learned. Next slide. One thing also we've noticed is sensitization. Are people ready? Do they understand why we're contacting them? So we sensitize them. Some of it is done by face-to-face. Some of it is done by radio. Some of it is done by calling people and sending SMS. So it's a really multi-channel approach. Next slide. Okay, thank you. So I think that would be it for now.
That's it. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Mondjii. And let me hand over now to Ms. Alexandra Letcher, Community Liaison Manager and Team Leader for Mines Advisory Group based in Erbil, Iraq.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. So today I'm going to be presenting on an INGO's perspective of what community engagement looks like in humanitarian mine action, with a specific focus on Iraq. Next slide, please. So where does the mine action sector stand on community engagement? Well, Mines Advisory Group, MAG, has been promoting community engagement under the term of community liaison from the onset in the 1990s, demonstrating that CL is really a prerequisite for humanitarian mine action across all of its pillars. Community liaison within MAG is a holistic approach that depends on our multi-skilled teams. Now, these teams address a wide range of activities, including non-technical survey as the starting point for land release. They support clearance operations, outcome and impact assessment, and of course, explosive ordnance risk education. So MAG does not have separate EORE or NTS teams, but rather CL teams who are recruited from local areas. They're gender balanced, they speak the local languages and dialects, and have a very good knowledge of the areas in which we're operating. And this local recruitment is really something that all operators in Iraq highlight as really key to having and achieving a conflict-sensitive approach. NPA, for example, points to achieving greater support from local authorities in overcoming obstacles such as access permissions due to their local recruitment in the areas in which they work. So as understandings of the critical importance of community engagement continue to develop and are challenged as well by changing and more protracted protection crises, the role of the standard community liaison officer is also changing and expanding and developing at the same time. Next slide, please. So what works well? I'm going to talk through 3 examples of approaches that we use in Iraq. The first being under non-technical survey, using a tool called community mapping. So gender, age, and conflict sensitive approaches are really key to achieving meaningful community engagement, with the aim to really base our interventions on the needs and priorities of the affected people that we're working with. The one way in which we encourage and use participatory information gathering is through this community mapping process. We find that mapping out contamination with the people in affected villages really visualizes, provides a visual of the problem, and also helps, see how different people in different groups perceive their environments differently. So we will find different results in, for example, women's groups versus men's groups. One challenge that we have found in certain areas in Iraq where we work is how do we ensure meaningful engagement when, for example, a population or a community has been displaced and is not able to easily return to their area of origin. We might only be able to engage directly with the community leader or key people within the community, which really narrows our channel of engagement. So I think in cases like these, we can really look to approaches that MAG is using in other contexts, such as Myanmar, Northeast Nigeria, using tools such as remote contamination baseline assessments and NTS-related interviews with key informants in IDP camps to try and build up this contamination profile remotely. Next slide, please. The second example is housing, land and property integration into community liaison. So as a humanitarian actor, we have a responsibility to ensure that we're not causing harm through the assistance that we're providing. Obviously, removing explosive ordnance from land does change its value, and that in turn impacts on land rights and land use. Particularly in Iraq, this is relevant because there are overlapping land tenure systems, and land rights can be very complex without the accompanying documentation. So in Iraq and now Syria, MAG has really expanded the scope of community liaison to assess and identify any disputes before clearance, and then refer any vulnerable households to specialist services such as NRC through a due diligence process. And what we found with this HLP due diligence and also MAG's approach to land release in urban areas is that it's really intensified but also broadened CL staff's engagement and interactions with community members, and to a certain extent has really provided a lot more opportunities for individuals within the community to engage in the planning and implementation of clearance. They're consulted individually on points such as use of mechanical assets, timing of clearance. So this kind of micro-level engagement is very time-intensive and by no means straightforward, but it does provide a lot of learning. And the Iraq Mine Action Subcluster is now also planning a training for other mine action operators on HLP issues. Next slide, please. Final example, coordination with development and stabilization actors, which MAG does in some areas of Iraq. Coordinating our interventions where relevant with, for example, supporting clearance for housing solutions to ensure safe and dignified returns really provides a different element to engagement with communities, as there's really a tangible, more tangible and long-term collective vision for the benefit of the community, which I think can be less evident in certain standalone HMA interventions. Next slide, please. So what other approaches are being used by other HMA operators in Iraq? Well, a few examples. HI is establishing community safety committees to engage representatives of communities in an advisory and decision-making role to see how risk reduction activities will be implemented in their communities. NPA, which traditionally doesn't see CL or community liaison as a standalone activity, has recently recruited community engagement positions for each district in Iraq, really acknowledging the liaison needed at multiple levels in Iraq in order to support the work. And finally, FSD really emphasizes gender and age inclusivity in how they select participants for their pre-clearance impact assessments through use of separate questionnaires, for example, for children and adults to assess perceptions of various age groups regarding the explosive ordnance threat and its impact. Next slide, please. What can be done better? Well, I think continuing to coordinate our approach towards community engagement, especially in areas where there are multiple operators, to avoid over-engagement of certain communities. Secondly, I think the pandemic has really challenged our understanding of what it means to engage with communities when the central principle of building trust and rapport, which is face-to-face contact, disappears. And while we do have examples of best practice, I think we can definitely learn from other areas, such as Viamo's presentation. And thirdly, I think we need greater acknowledgement of community engagement as an approach that is time-intensive, largely invisible work that's difficult to quantify through traditional outputs, and we need to make sure that the resources are put towards it. So 2 examples from MAG are trialling positions that are dedicated to liaising with local authorities, local partners and other parties in Sri Lanka, and recognizing the importance of community engagement through MAG's development of a global technical standard just for community liaison. Last slide, please. So to conclude and to come back to the themes of this year's NDM, we shall continue to really persevere and adapt to different forms of community engagement when faced with challenges such as COVID-19. We shall continue to seek out partnerships for a more cohesive approach to community engagement. And finally, we shall really look to progress in drawing on more inclusive ways to engage with communities and also recognize the real importance of community engagement through the inclusion of a separate chapter in UNMAS on community engagement or community liaison. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Letcher. And let me hand over now to Ms. Lyuba Guerassimova, Program Officer based in Kabul, Afghanistan, and working on explosive ordnance risk education for UNMAS. Over to you, Ms. Guerassimova.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, good morning to everyone. I will now speak a little about how we are trying to do things better in Afghanistan, specifically when it comes to explosive ordnance risk education. Next slide, please. So I think as many of you are aware, community engagement itself is not new to Afghanistan at all. In fact, it's very closely linked to the ability of mine action actors to deliver. This includes community-based demining, community liaison, of course, and access negotiation. It's also a key factor when it comes to prioritizing hazards, where community needs are considered, community requests as well are a big part of that, and also looking at casualties and population movements as well. We also are looking at impact assessments when it comes to the community after land release. However, when it comes to risk education, it was a bit lacking when it comes to the community engagement aspect of it, and the method of delivering risk education has not changed in quite a long time. That's why in 2019, UNMAS decided to embark on this new initiative and look at a new approach, namely behavior change communication. Next slide, please. One company was contracted to work on a BCC, or behavior change communication strategy, because risk education is not really a one-size-fits-all approach. And through behavior change communication, we can listen to the communities better, understand their motivations for their behavior. It's also a more holistic approach. During this strategy development, what factors were looked at were the various psychological, social factors, environmental factors that can influence the behavior of separate groups. Also, the groups that were looked at were men, women, boys, and girls, of course, but also travelers as a separate group, because travelers are quite a large group when it comes to truck drivers, when it comes to returnees from the neighboring countries, and also internally displaced persons. So these are very often unaware of the situation in their host communities. And the idea with this new targeted messaging is to not just instruct people, but to actually appeal to them in a more emotional way, but also to give them the information and empower them to decide on their own, to do their own risk assessment. So the way we are trying to frame the messaging is not telling people what not to do, but rather explain to them the various threats, and also explain them what maybe they can do if they want, or what they should do rather than not do. For each group, the strategy looks at the different factors, and also from that, a key message is derived. And from the key message, we have some broken down messages. So, for example, when we look at boys, some of the factors are that boys are considered basically that they want to fit in with their community and with their peer group. They also should be brave. At the same time, they also lack livelihood opportunities. So from that, we had one core message that brave boys should practice safe behaviors. And the key messages then, depending on the environment, is, for example, the best way to support your family is to stay alive. That's all when it comes to the livelihood opportunity aspect. Also, another message is be brave and be a hero. Don't let your friends go into unsafe areas or touch unknown objects, which basically makes the boy look more like a hero to the peer group. And based on this strategy, we started looking at implementing new activities, child-centering material, but also public service announcement for travelers and others. Next slide, please. With the new approach, we also need to keep listening to the communities and trying to understand them. We therefore don't just develop material, but also include different types of surveys in what we do, usually baseline and endline surveys, but also some smaller ones. In this way, we understand the media consumption and preferences of receiving information, what existing knowledge there is, existing attitudes, also experience linked to explosive ordnance. We are also integrating more questions into existing tools that we have and that we are improving, such as community impact evaluation. And we have found that, for example, in a recent survey that we had through Viamo, actually, shout out to Guy here, we found that quite a large percentage of people still think that it is perfectly safe to bury a device or move it or take it apart to collect valuable metals, go closer to it and check it. So we do still keep asking this question just to understand basically if the risk education material has any impact, if people are changing their behavior, and also to just see if we are on track and something else needs to change. Next slide, please. And beside the surveys, of course, a key aspect is engaging the communities throughout the material development. So the way we start when it comes to developing new material is internal expertise, including through the regional offices, the technical working group, and the national authority, DMAC, where also the approval of the material takes place. However, throughout the whole process, we try to engage the community in the specific target groups better. For example, travelers, children, and we do that through field testing, to focus group discussions, and when feasible, engaging some beneficiaries in a workshop. Through that, for example, we found that when developing a comic book that was quite a long process and involved a lot of feedback from different sides, children provided very important feedback when it comes to the illustration, when it comes to how the speech bubbles are positioned. And these things are very important to consider when it comes to especially developing new initiatives. We also found through engaging more with communities and with beneficiaries that we actually have to look at other factors beyond simple messaging, for example, incentives for risk-taking behavior when it comes to scrap metal collection. Through also partnering with some organizations such as UNICEF and Save the Children, we are also trying to look at how they can fit our material into their initiatives and what feedback we can get from that side. Next slide, please. And I think I don't have enough time, so you can go to the next one as well. This was a very short one anyways. So to sum up, what works well is just field testing with the actual target groups. For example, we tested with children in urban schools, in rural schools, also in public and private ones. We are also trying to ask questions in a new way, asking more about past behavior as opposed to what would you do. We also are trying to carefully manage each step to ensure that we have feedback on all the sides, whether it's the context, the illustration, the sound level, and the various voices, and also even when it comes down to the paper quality and how long it will last when children keep using it. What we can do better is, well, in terms of managing expectations when providing feedback, we do sometimes have a lot of feedback and it's contradicting each other. And we also have feedback which we don't necessarily want to adopt. For example, in some focus group discussions or field testing, we heard things like women are stubborn, and in this script they're portrayed as such, so that's perfectly fine, it makes sense. Or when you illustrate children, it's not okay for the girls to walk in front of the boys. So things like that, we really try to see, do we actually want to adopt that feedback? Some other things that we really want to look at a bit more closely is assessing the currently used approaches in schools when it comes to risk education, because a lot of people actually have been saying that they received risk education in schools, but we don't understand how effective that is. Also, utilizing some more engaging methods like games could also contribute to reaching some other communities that are not reached through the current methods. Also identifying what behavior we want to change. That's, do we want people to listen to the message and report something? Do we want them to mark the area? Do we want them to organize a meeting in the village and inform everyone else? And also the perhaps trickiest bit, which I left for the end and might be subject to discussion later, is how to measure actually behavior change and if our way of reaching the community actually is effective. Over from my side, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ms. Guerassimova. And we hand over now to the floor for questions and answers from our panelists. We have two questions already in the chat. Let me read them both. One is for Ms. Panharith. Can you please elaborate further on the referral and support services that exist between CMAA and other line ministries or authorities responsible for supporting victims and survivors? And do community volunteers continue to play a role once the referrals took place? Over to you, Mr. Panharith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. CMA works with these community network volunteers and other physical rehabilitation centers to identify and document the needs of these direct and indirect victims. And then other ministry is responsible for victim assistance approach CMA and request for this data. We also developed other documents or report like the quality of life survey, and we share this document with the victim assistance stakeholders. The community network volunteer play some roles after this service took place. Keep in mind that the volunteers are based in the community, so they can, mingle around with these villagers. So they can still follow up with the information, asking questions if they have received the service, what the quality of the service is, something like that. I hope I can answer this question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And actually, there is a second question for you. Could you explain more on how community leaders have been organized in the larger national network, how local leaders share information, knowledge, good practices within this network, and any good practices identify that local leaders and the CMAA work together to solve differences and conflicts within the community via community engagement approach?
Thank you. There seems to be more than one question here. Let me try to answer. I hope I can do it. Let me try first. I will pick up the example of our planning and prioritization process for mine clearance as an example. So we have the chief of village who first organize the consultation or discussion in the village to identify the problems based on criteria like the level of threat, the needs of the development in the village, and the identity of the beneficiary, like if they are disabled, if they are the widow, or something like that. So this at the village level, and then when it go up, the chief of village will represent their village in the higher level discussion to present their needs and priority. So that's where they can share their problem, they can share their knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And there is another question from the floor for Alexandra Letcher. Could you please elaborate a bit on how meaningful is evidence and related to relevance, effectiveness, and efficiency? How do you establish what is meaningful to whom, including ensuring feedback loops are closed? Over to you.
Yeah, so it's a challenging question. Thank you. I think when I was referring to meaningful engagement, it was in two examples. So the first being in NTS, where, for example, we might have, in certain cases, a narrower channel of engagement, meaning we have less diversity, fewer groups to consult in communities where the majority of the community may still be dispersed across a large geographic area. And what does that mean in terms of our engagement, the information that we're collecting? Is it meaningful? Are we getting all of the groups buy-in? Are we getting all of the groups, different groups and individuals that make up that community? Are we getting their interests and their opinions and their voices heard? I think the second case was really to do with our work pre-clearance and during clearance. Our approach to urban clearance in MAG is now to subdivide areas into smaller areas and then engage with each small groups, small neighborhoods in those areas, and then getting a larger diversity of views, consultations with people, getting more, I would say it's definitely more relevant because we get a lot more opinions and views of people. It's definitely more effective because we are able to provide more, a better intervention based on the needs and priorities of each neighborhood. Whether it's more efficient, that's something we really have to balance with our clearance teams. And I think, as I was saying during my presentation, it does make our, the community liaison staff's job a lot more complex, but they are there every day in the field with the communities, closing that feedback loop, consulting them, coming back with the solutions, face-to-face contact, which is how we ensure that they understand the process of clearance and what is happening and how they've been consulted.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alexandra. We have another question actually for all the speakers, but I think that Alessia wants to provide some examples to this one. The question is about COVID. So are there any community engagement, good practice, community engagement related good practices in the COVID environment, coping with the COVID difficulties that could be shared? Over to you, Alessia.
Thank you, Meritxell. So COVID has definitely posed a lot of challenges in terms of community engagement, because a lot of what we did directly with communities couldn't be done anymore due to the physical distancing requirements. So on the one hand, we found that our programs tended to shift much more towards remote approaches like digital and social media, or examples like we heard from Viamo, or the Internet of Good Things that use low-end mobile devices so they can reach more widely. They have a greater reach. We also found, for example, that radio, some programs started using radios even for training staff, for conducting debates. Things were being done over the radio. So really reflecting on remote approaches, working through leaders who would be in the community anyway. So reaching the leaders out maybe through mobile devices with key messages, and going through them in order for the messages to reach the communities. Obviously, loudspeakers being used in the community for key messages, and also looking at integration of your services, of your content, of your messages into services that not only continued but got strengthened. For example, the health services very much started focusing much more on COVID prevention, on COVID testing, and other services, other messaging could be integrated into that, into services that keep going. So thinking very much at what is there that you can integrate in and use as an entry point. So these are just some examples.
Thank you so much, Alessia. And let me then thank you all for your participation. We have learned today that community engagement is about creating dialogue with the communities, it's about empowerment, it's about data, it's about technology. It's all in a continuum. We reach the communities, we consult them, we involve them, we collaborate with them, and we share leadership with communities. And often in Mind Action, we limit ourselves to the initial steps of community engagement, the reaching out and the consultation, but those are only initial steps. These are not comprehensive engagement. We can do better. And thanks to our distinguished panelists, we have learned today from Cambodia, Nigeria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and from the new minimum standards on community engagement, how can we do better? This should also remind ourselves of one of the key Grand Bargain commitments, that community engagement is a participation revolution. We include people receiving aid in making the decisions which affect their lives. So thank you so much, colleagues. This has been an extremely rich conversation. I hope that it was also very useful for you. And with this, I'll hand over to Mr. Bruno Donat right now. Over to you, Bruno.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for this excellent session. So a quick announcement and about the 6 next sessions. So when we leave here, we will go directly in 2 minutes at 3 p.m. Geneva time to 3 concurrent side events. One on cash and voucher assistance, one on women inclusion in Mind Action, one on the stage of play linking Mind Action to SDGs. That's from 3 to 4 Geneva time. Then there will be a break, half hour. Don't leave for the whole day. Do something for 30 minutes. When you come back, we are not going to be in plenary. You will still have to go to side events. And the next one after would be demining in border areas, enhancing cross-border cooperation. Another one is managing uncertainty in an explosive, hazard, contaminated environment. And the 6th one in the second session of 3 side events is impact on explosive ordnance on vulnerable people in Syria, specifically children. Then back to back, there will be a session to end the day Geneva time, 5:30 to 6:30 on localizing Mind Action, how to improve. If Caitlin, you're around, teach us once more when we leave here how to find a side event, because that's where we're going now.
Hi, Bruno. I'd be happy to show everyone that. So here we are on the main page. We're on reception and where everyone is currently here on plenary. So following this plenary session, we're going to click on side event over here on the side. So here you can see the 3 side events that are coming up just now at 3 p.m. Geneva time. So if everyone can navigate from the plenary tab to the side event tab and make your way to your side event of preference, now is the time.
Thank you so much. Let's log off very soon from here. Remember, the plenary at 5:30 when you're back will have simultaneous interpretation, but not the 6 side events that separate us two. So see you later and join the side events. Goodbye.